Hey everybody, Stephen Clyder of the Peace and Liberty Podcast. We are back for episode 47. I'm joined by my good friend Kyle Anzalone of the Foreign Policy Focus Podcast, and you can find him at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. He hosts a really great show. He's one of the smartest guys I know related to foreign policy, so glad to have you back on, Kyle.
Yeah, thanks for that overly generous introduction, Stephen.
Oh no, you deserve it, man. People like you and Scott Horton, I will come to you, a world porter, for like any question I have. Like that's it. There's no one else I need to go to. But I guess today we're going to talk about the Iran nuclear deal. So obviously a few days ago, I think it was the 7th, that Trump announced that he's going to withdraw from the nuclear deal. So maybe just give us some background related to all this.
Yeah, maybe it was the 8th, I think. Anyways, so you have the Iran nuclear agreement, which was negotiated under the Obama administration, mostly, or I think completely, maybe after Hillary Clinton left Secretary of State duties. A deal was brokered between the United States, Germany, France, the UK, Russia, and China are all signatories to this deal, which is known as the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran nuclear deal, the P5+1 nuclear agreement, etc. You know, there's so many damn names for this thing that, kind of gets confusing too. And I think that maybe makes it over technical because sometimes they just use the initials JCPOA. I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I was muted. Do you think they purposely do that? Like make it super complicated so no one can understand?
Sometimes not. I'm guessing that like the shorthand is probably helpful, maybe translating internationally. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, anyways, tell us a little bit more about the JCPOA, because there were a lot of conditions that went along with it when it was passed.
Right. So I guess to highlight the major conditions of the JCPOA is that under the Obama administration, they put a lot of international sanctions on Iran leading up to 2015, and that the other countries of the world went along with these sanctions. And I think this, should show something else too, that Russia and Iran are not like the best of allies or anything like that. It's not like the United States. If, like, let's say somebody was attempting to put sanctions on Israel, we would veto that in the UN every single time and would prevent it from happening. But Russia did allow these sanctions to be put on Iran. With some amount of, I'm sure, resistance. But at the end of the day, they could have vetoed it.
Now, what do these sanctions consist of?
They're economic sanctions against Iran. One of the big ones that I could talk specifically to is sanctions against Iran's civilian commercial airline program. This has actually caused Iran's air fleet to be way out of date, and plane crashes aren't quite as uncommon in Iran as they should be, just because they're prevented from being sold new airplanes. In fact, one of the few big contracts that were negotiated from a U.S. company to Iran while the JCPOA was in effect was between Boeing and Iran to sell, I believe, about 100 commercial planes, or a significant number of parts for those planes. So anyways, those economic sanctions were one portion of the JCPOA, and they were repealed. At the same time, Iran had a civilian nuclear energy program and was a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This means that Iran is able to have a civilian energy program that produces nuclear energy that they get to their civilians or whatever, and then they have certain conditions, like they could enrich uranium up to 19.5%. They're able to have heavy water reactors under the NPT. They're able to have lots of centrifuges enrich the uranium. They're able to hold a large portion of that uranium. And these are all things that any country with a civilian energy program could have. However, under the terms of the JCPOA, Iran agreed to destroy their heavy water reactor, destroy over half of their centrifuges. They would no longer enrich uranium up to 19.5%, which is still only, energy grade. It is nowhere near nuclear weapons grade, but it is only now enriched uranium up to 3.66%, I believe.
And what are centrifuges for people who don't know?
What they do is they take, I guess, the waste from nuclear energy, and through some other chemical processes that I don't understand because I'm not a nuclear scientist, are able to spin down that waste into enriched uranium, and so then they're able to use that as nuclear fuel.
Here's what I'm trying to understand is it hard to hide the fact that you're enriching uranium? Because what I'm going to start by talking about is, think about the weapons of mass destruction that they were saying they could detect this from satellites. I don't even know what kind of weapons of mass destruction they were talking about with regard to that, but is uranium something that's kind of hard to hide?
Yeah. And you need a lot of it to make a nuclear weapon, and you need a lot of it to make a kind of weapon that, and I don't even know if it's really possible even to just use an enriched uranium to actually make the kind of nuclear weapon that you could then put on the head of a missile. Because remember, these nuclear weapons are extremely heavy. And so I guess you can make one that's a lot larger and a lot heavier, but then you can't put it on a missile because a missile can't carry it. It takes a lot of force to push that missile upright. And also remember that Iran's ballistic missiles aren't able to carry nuclear weapons. They're too small. And they only have a missile program where they could launch missile 2,000 kilometers, which does put Israel in the range, but certainly nowhere near the United States of America.
Right. It's kind of like North Korea. Like, they could probably hit Seoul, but they probably couldn't hit the U.S. if they tried, right?
Yeah. Now, as far as it goes as being able to detect the Iranian, if let's say, everybody believes, which is completely untrue, that Iran is attempting to make a nuclear weapon. But let's just say that you believe tomorrow, for whatever reason, every Persian in Iran decides that they want to make a nuclear weapon. It would take a long time for them to do so. And part of what the JCPOA does is it puts additional restrictions on Iran's nuclear program. Some of those we talked about, limiting the number of centrifuges, destroying the heavy water reactor, which produces waste that's much easier to spin down the centrifuges and make enriched uranium. They've limited the total amount of uranium they have. And so I think to 300 kilograms. This is 5% of what they were holding before. They shipped out 95% of their uranium stockpile. And then they also put cameras and inspection facilities in all of IAEA inspectors in all their facilities. And so it's not really something that you could hide. And then there's the additional protocol that basically says, if evidence is presented to the signatories to the JCPOA, and a majority of those signatories, which could just mean the US, the UK, France, and Germany would be a majority, are convinced that there's evidence to show that Iran has any kind of nuclear program outside of what they disclosed in the JCPOA anywhere in Iran, the IAEA will go search if a majority of countries believe. And like I said, those could only be the American allies. And so it would be impossible for Iran to secretly make a nuclear weapon. And as I said on my show, that I point out that there's apparently 29% of Americans who thought it was a good idea to withdraw from the Iran nuclear agreement. I'm sure those 29% of Americans would believe and say it's really important for America to be able to detect that Iran, if they were trying to secretly make a nuclear weapon. And this is the one thing that the JCPOA definitely prevents from happening, is Iran from secretly making a nuclear weapon. Not going to happen under the JCPOA.
Now, another crazy thing people might not think about is, well, I don't even know, is uranium used just for kind of regular daily energy, like for electricity and general stuff?
Yeah, it's used to make nuclear energy. Now, you could also take it and enrich it way up. I think 95% is the weapons grade, but again, not a nuclear scientist. I only know what I'm able to read. And at that, you could do some other things to it. And the way you make the explosion happen, you can make a nuclear weapon. It's also important to note that Iran has never carried out a nuclear weapons test. And this is something that countries would definitely need to do to be able to make a bomb that could fit on the head of a missile, is they would have to carry out some kind of test to make sure the weapon worked. Because it's an extremely difficult thing to achieve.
I think what's hard is some people just cannot put themselves in their shoes because they hate them. So they hate Iran. So imagine if it were us, that we had such tough sanctions on us, that we're being monitored constantly, that any evidence from any other countries that we're doing something would lead to like this full scale, pretty much invasion because such a large country. This is crazy. Imagine if it were us. Excuse me.
Yeah, well, I think a part of it is that I think if I were just to go and knock on all my neighbors' doors right now and ask them, does Iran want a nuclear weapon? And just kind of say, like, all things aside, like, if Iran could either choose to have one or not, I think everybody would say is, oh, yeah, Iran wants a nuclear weapon. And evidence has shown that's really not the case. Iran hasn't done anything in the realm of moving towards nuclear weapons since 2003. Now, pre-2003, Iran had a nuclear weapons program that did violate some of the safeguards of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. However, that was only an exploratory program. So it's not like they were actually researching how to make a nuclear weapon. They were researching what it would take should they choose to pursue that path. Now, some people have even suggested that Iran wasn't necessarily concerned about making nuclear weapons on their own, but were concerned about Saddam Hussein developing nuclear weapons. And if you'll remember back to 2001, 2002, that was a very large concern of all Americans. And remember, that's the reason we invaded Iraq, is that we were convinced Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons. And so if you remember the 1980s, Iran and Iraq were in a brutal war where Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against the people of Iran. And so it's not unrealistic to believe a scenario where, yeah, the government of Iran was concerned enough about Saddam Hussein using weapons of mass destruction against the Iranians. And so they looked at what it would take, what Saddam Hussein's breakout capabilities would be. So they know, hey, if he does come within a month of making nuclear weapons, then maybe we need to launch an attack, right?
Like what you said, it would take a long time. They couldn't, even if everyone got up and started making a chemical weapon, it would take, or a nuclear weapon or any weapon, it would take a long time.
Yeah, I think the estimates I've seen are over a year for Iran to have the breakout capabilities they need. And remember, they're not even near having a missile that could hit the United States of America. I mean, their range is 2,000 kilometers. They could hit the middle of China and Israel. How far away from that is the United States of America?
Yeah. Like I said, my guest today is Kyle Anzalone. He hosts the Foreign Policy Focus. You can find that at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. Kyle, I forgot to write down the 2 latest episodes you did, or maybe it was the last 2 or 3. You did one where you talked about before Trump announced the nuclear, before he was going to make a decision. Then you did an episode after. Which episodes were those, so I can link to those?
Those were 190 and 191. Yeah. And so, kind of as I was saying before, and I just wanted to finish off that thought, since 2003, Iran has, made no efforts or goals to get a nuclear weapon. For what it's worth, the Ayatollah has issued a fatwa, or religious edict, against nuclear weapons. And there's just been no evidence to suggest that Iran actually wants a nuclear weapon. Maybe they want to have a civilian program with the capabilities that, they would be able to produce the material needed to make a nuclear weapon should the United States take a more hostile route against that country. I think having that possibility is probably something that Iran views as somewhat strategic importance to their national security. But at the same time, there's absolutely no evidence that the Iranians are looking to pursue a nuclear weapon. And again, what would they do with it? If you look at the battlefield of the Middle East, what was one nuclear weapon going to do? You're going to take out Tel Aviv, and then Israel is going to level the rest of Iran with nuclear weapons? Because that's what would happen. I mean, Iran would need to make tons of nuclear weapons because their enemies in the Middle East certainly aren't even limited to just Israel. The UAE and Saudi Arabia have very advanced military sold to them by the United States and are very hostile to the Iranian government and the Iranian country. And so, and then you have the Americans as well. And you would think that if Iran launched an aggressive war of nuclear weapons against Israel, America would immediately respond and, wipe Tehran off the face of the map, if not a larger portion of Iran. And so, if you look at just what would happen, Iran has no strategic advantage in using an offensive nuclear weapon.
And to what depth do we fund these people? Because I think on one hand, when you fund Israel, but we also fund a lot of people that hate Israel. I think that that's one of the craziest things people say now is if you're against the state of Israel, whatever you want to call it, you're anti-Semitic. When in reality, you're just talking about, mostly just talking about the funding. Like we just don't want to have this foreign aid and billions of dollars going to these places. But also, if you're for Israel, wouldn't you be against us funding these psychopaths on the other side?
Well, I mean, just completely related to the Iran deal. I mean, this was guaranteed to make sure that Iran did not develop a secret nuclear weapon. And so, the neocon Israel lobby ultimate fear is true, is that what the Iranians want to do is take their nuclear weapon, drive it from the land bridge of Tehran to Beirut that they, make up through Iraq and Syria, and then drive it into Tel Aviv or something and detonate it. This is the one thing that would make sure that that absolutely could not happen. and this is what the Israel lobby opposes. And so, I think Will Porter pointed out on an episode of Hapa Supremacy that he was on, that one of the things that they were afraid of with the Iran nuclear deal, the Israel lobby, is that will work out, because then there's no reason for a hostile American policy against Iran. It kind of takes that off the table. If Iran and the United States become allies, then the importance of selling F-35s and all these other advanced American weapons to the Middle East, the Sunni countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Israel, becomes an awful lot less important.
I mean, what do the Sunnis mostly think of Iran right now? I mean, what would you say are the biggest countries like against Iran in the Middle East?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know how much the whole idea that like all the Sunnis hate all the Shia is true. And I'm guessing it's, like most wars, that leadership of those two groups have some legitimate hatreds against each other, but mostly are probably, exploiting the people in fear to, aggrandize their own powers. However, generally the Sunni governments of the Middle East align themselves against the Iranians, and so that would be the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain and Kuwait. However, I guess this is less true of Turkey, which is a Sunni country, which certainly has warmer relations with Iran than the rest of the Middle East, and Qatar, who share I think the world's largest natural gas field with Iran. And since Qatar was blocked off from the rest of the Middle East, has moved closer diplomatically to Iran. Although I'm told that narrative may be a little bit overblown, and Qatar has just mostly moved closer to Turkey and away from Saudi Arabia.
Like I said, I'm going to link to episode 190 and 191 of Foreign Policy Focus. You talked in episode 191, you give, I think, like 7 or 8 clips of Trump just talking, and he's flat out lying in some of the clips. He's saying, maybe I'll let you explain it.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had those notes right in front of me. Oh, maybe I have them right here, actually. So a couple of, I guess, the outright lies would be that the Iran nuclear deal, at its completion, which, like, there are some agreements within the deal that sunset after 10 or 15 years. And so, yes, eventually, again, Iran would start to be allowed to have a more normalized civilian nuclear energy program. Maybe they could go back up to enriching uranium up to 19.5%. They could rebuild some of the centrifuges.
I'm sorry to interrupt you real quick. I just want to ask one question. How long was the deal supposed to be in place for? Is the point that they were supposed to like renew this deal soon, or how long was it in place for?
I think there's some sunsets at 10 to 15 years. I'm not sure. There may be some provisions of the deal that actually don't have an expiration date.
Gotcha.
And so this, 2025, 2030 is when we're talking about some of these sunsets kicking in. Of course, that leaves the United States of America 10 years to make a deal with Iran on something. The greatest negotiator on the history of the planet, Donald Trump, couldn't get the Iranians to come to some sort of deal within the next 10 years. That's, that he should laugh at himself for saying that. But this is, the position of Donald Trump, is they're just going to wait it out to the sunsets. Of course, this is an additional protocols agreement, which means Iran would still be within the non-proliferation treaty, which every other country of the world, minus Israel, India, China, India, Pakistan, and South Sudan, are signatories to. And this is how the rest of the world moderates how they treat their nuclear weapons. And of course, if you look at how schizophrenic the U.S. policy has been in the Middle East, from arming the Mujahideen to fighting them in Afghanistan, Iraq, to then arming them in Libya and Syria, to then fighting them in Iraq and Syria. In 10 years, Iran could be our allies, and we want them to have nuclear weapons. You know what I mean? It doesn't, I mean, like the sunsets aren't necessarily a bad thing. And also, there's plenty of other ways to get around this, to have additional deals to build on the peace here. I mean, that's the way diplomacy is often done, isn't by one grand bargain where one side agrees to give away all their deterrents at the end and normalize relations. It's a series of small agreements, and you build more and more towards the solution in the, hopefully peace that you want to see. You can't expect that it's all going to come from just one conversation. That's stupid.
Now, we're talking today on May 11th. Now, did we pull out of the agreement? Is that 100% going to happen?
Yeah, Trump signed some presidential memo, I think he called it, that said the United States was withdrawing from the agreement. Now, I think it's like 90 days for some of the sanctions to go back in place. I'm not sure. Maybe Trump could rush them if he really wants to. I'm not sure how the legality of all this is going to play out. I know that they, I guess, notified companies like Boeing that they have 90 days and then, no more trade to Iran.
Yeah.
And I guess that means that, but it seemed odd to you that Boeing's not going to find a way to make this $20 billion deal happen?
I
think
pay
enough senators? And so what I'm guessing is going to happen is that at least some of these countries are going to be able to bribe themselves some exemptions here. And, in that way, I guess Trump withdrawing from the Iran nuclear agreement is a little bit less terrible than it seems right now.
Yeah, well, I totally agree. I think for people who had no idea what the Iran nuclear deal was, they probably have some idea of what it is now. And it's always enlightening having you on, Kyle. Like I said, I'm going to be linking to Foreign Policy Focus episodes 190 and 191. You can find them at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. And I believe Immersion News is your other website. How do you spell that?
IMMERSIONNEWS.com. Yeah, and that's my news website, immersionnews.com. I'm constantly posting articles, all the things that I read that make me know so much about some of these things. I post up there. So if you want to read some of that stuff, sometimes I call it like a giant show notes page for my podcast, even, because what I talk about there is usually up there.
All right, awesome, Kyle. Well, it's always a pleasure having you on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Steven.
Hey everyone, please like, follow, donate, subscribe, and share. Any donations will be used to reach more people.